heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
We are privileged now to talk with Dr. Andrew Wilson, and he is the author of a book that we've been hearing a lot about, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. Now, if you've listened to Point of View any length of time, you know that we oftentimes talk about how significant the year 1776 was, because we're talking about everything from the Declaration of Independence to the fact that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. Sometimes we even refer to some of the philosophical issues and technological issues. And as you will see, this book pulls it all together in a way that I think you're going to find very helpful. Book's been out for a while. We have information about it on our website in case you would like to find it. And again, I might just mention that Dr. Andrew Wilson has his doctorate from King's College London. He's a teaching pastor at King's Church London, a columnist for Christianity Today, has degrees in history and theology from Cambridge, from King's College London, and of course is the author of a number of books that we'll mention along the way. But first of all, Dr. Andrew Wilson, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
What we're going to be talking about over this next hour are the 7 transformations, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, globalization, even which is called the Great Enrichment, not to mention, of course, the American Revolution. But the thesis is very simple. 1776, more than any other year in the last millennium, is the year that really kind of made us who we are. Can you explain?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there are a number of developments that happened in this one year that profoundly shaped the way that we are today, and they interact with each other in really fascinating ways that many of us have not really thought about. I think in your nation, more than mine, people are very aware of the founding of, obviously, American democracy, but what people often aren't aware of is that the key developments that created the culture of Romanticism, or really the institutional elite leaving behind of Christianity, into a post-Christian sort of phase of history. The enrichment, the economic growth, the industrial technology that you just alluded to, globalization, and then the way in which the Enlightenment seeped through into the whole of society. And that all of those developments really have landmark events, or in many ways the landmark event taking place in this one extraordinary year, which happens to be the year that your nation traces its origin story, and the year that my nation lost one of its favorite colonies. But other than that, it's actually an extraordinary development for the world as a whole, but one that most of us would probably see just through the lens of a political and a democratic experiment in one particular nation. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is this is a much larger, more transformative event for the modern world, and it's very important to understanding not just why the modern world is as it is, but how Christians who want to live faithfully within that world, which is rapidly changing and challenging, and that raises all sorts of uncomfortable questions for us, might benefit from knowing that backstory and understanding how the church, even at the time, learned to respond to it. So that's the thesis of the book in a nutshell. And
again, these transformations kind of, as you said, remade the world, influenced the way we think about God, the way we think about our human experiences, the universe, just about everything. And so, again, very important issue. Let me, for the listeners that oftentimes like to take some notes as we go through this, to say that you use this acrostic or acronym WEIRDER, which stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, Democratic, Ex-Christian, and Romantic. And I thought that was a good way to help put that together, but it illustrates again that we're talking about not just one or two transformations, some of which we talk about even in this booklet that we've made available recently for our listeners about historical cycles, but 7 that all really kind of culminate at the same time. And again, back to your thesis, more than any other year, I think you were right, unless you want to go all the way back to when, about 250 years before that, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door. You've just never had anything so significant as this year, 1776.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think is the case. And it surprised me when I first started looking into it, because I didn't know that the invention of the steam engine and the Wealth of Nations and American democracy all came out at the same time. And I didn't know that the many, many other things that were developing at the same time within the church and outside it, intellectually and socially. So I agree with you. I think it is one of those epoch-defining years, which partly is just a really great story, because when you get these... See, the thing about the Reformation, you just use that example, is you have one very, very important development within Christianity and Europe, but it doesn't really dovetail in the same way with a massive development in technology and a massive development in globalization, and not in the same year anyway, within the same couple of generations, but not the same year. And so the joy of 1776 is, in some ways, it's a very familiar story, particularly to many people, many of your listeners, many people in your nation. But in some ways, it's a thoroughly unfamiliar story, because the vast majority of people who know the American story very well will know probably very little about what's going on in Italian cafes and English pubs and factories and Scottish, poker clubs and German, gatherings together of various romantic artists and playwrights and things. And so being able to see how those things all relate together is part of anything else. It's actually a really interesting story, I think. Whether I've done it justice is another matter, but I think there's an extraordinary confluence of events, which also then set up the way we are to live in the world now, and make it quite a sort of provocative challenge to us to think through how our current cultural moment is the product of lots of different sorts of influences. It's not just what's going on politically or intellectually or culturally. It's also sometimes what's going on socioeconomically and technologically. And all of those things come together in this particular year. And of course, all of them are still reverberating in our day now. So those of us who are trying to work out how to handle a post-Christian generation wisely, which I imagine we are, have got a lot to learn from seeing how these different things all interact with each other.
Talking with Andrew Wilson, and again, the book is entitled Remaking the World. It actually is 11 chapters, and I might just mention that we actually taped this before because he is over in England, and that made it much easier for him. But we do have some links on the website if you'd like to know a little bit more. First of all, of course, we have a link to him. You can go to desiringgod.org and then /Andrew-Wilson, and you can find some of his articles, which will be very helpful. And of course, this book, which has been out for some time, so it may be more difficult to find in your bookstore. But again, the thing that I've been so impressed with is, even though this is a fairly lengthy book, Crossways has kept the title and the amount pretty low. And so again, you can get it in hardback or Kindle, and I think you're going to find it very helpful. So when we come back, I'm going to spend some time looking at each one of these particular transformations, very significant ones on globalization, enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, what is called the Great Enrichment, the American Revolution, and really the rise of kind of a post-Christianity, the dawn of Romanticism. We'll kind of work our way through each one of those, and I think you will find this book very helpful and the discussion very helpful as well. In some respects, it parallels some of the material we've covered before here on Point of View, both in my latest booklet on the historical cycles. A little bit later, you'll see the connection to the biblical view on sex and culture, as well as some of the material even in my new book on discerning the future. So in some respects, if we want to understand the future, we need to look to the past. And this particular book, Remaking the World, is one of those very significant books that I wanted you to know about. We'll take a break, be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Kerry Newhoff has been producing a podcast for church leaders and has been on my radio program. A few months ago, I quoted him because he documented that the current percentages for church attendance are inflated. His more recent podcast not only documents that evangelicals aren't attending church, but also provides reasons why many churches are losing members. He quotes from a researcher who concludes that there are as many non-attending self-described evangelicals as there are mainline Christians in America. He says this marks a seismic shift in how the church will do ministry. Of course, the goal of discipleship isn't church attendance, but certainly should be considered a first step. He provides 3 reasons churches are losing members. First is greater affluence. Americans with money have options such as technology options, travel options, and options for kids. He doesn't say this, but I would add the impact of team sports that often has families on the road to attend games instead of going to church. A second reason is self-directed spirituality. People are looking less to churches and leaders to help them grow spiritually. He uses a good illustration. No parent makes a visit to a doctor's office without checking the symptoms online. Before buying a car, they will probably research it online. A third reason people are attending church less often is their failure to see any direct benefit. People always make time for the things they value most. Now, he isn't advocating for churches to do more promotion, especially since the youngest generation is sick of hype. Adding more high-tech AV in the church service isn't the answer. Instead, people are looking for more authenticity and community. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about the book Remaking the World, how 1776 created the post-Christian world. And I think, first of all, what we would want to do, Dr. Andrew Wilson, is talk about the W. And that, I have to say, is one that hadn't really occurred to me, even though we talk about globalization here on Point of View. You point to Captain James Cook's third voyage, and also just this idea that now we could begin to understand the world in a globalist sense. And again, a lot of that goes back to the year 1776.
It definitely does. I think it's James Cook is a well-known figure on my island. I guess he would be I was in a musical based on his life when I was about 8 years old in a school. So he's not the George Washington figure, but he would be better known here than he would be, no doubt, over there. But it's more that these two circumnavigations of the world that he does in the previous 5 or 6 years prove enormously significant in connecting up parts of the world that had previously not really been very connected. And what I do in that chapter, and the story I find fascinating to tell, is the way in which the encounters that Western people had with non-Western peoples raised all sorts of questions for them about why some nations had what we now call development studies. Why were some of them more technologically advanced, in some cases dramatically more than others? And what is it about Western nations and the Western part of the world that enabled it to be significantly more technologically advanced than, say, the Australian Aboriginals or the Tahitian Islanders or whoever? And why is it that even some of those societies were more advanced than each other? And what's the deep roots, the sort of going back 10,000 years, as to why Western societies developed first, in the sense that they did, into industrial technology, enrichment, and some of the other things that come on later in the book. And I find that such a fascinating story, in part because you can see people in the late 18th century wrestling with it in real time. So it's not just that we're back projecting our interesting question. It's that they are visiting islands with people from Tahiti or whatever, and then they go along to an island where the people look just like the Tahitians, but they are up 500 years further back in terms of their development. And they're asking questions like, how on earth has this happened? They look like the people look the same, but somehow there's something about me. Is it the land, which means that somehow they are nowhere near as developed or advanced technologically and socially as they might be on an island that might only be a few miles away. What's the story? What is it that makes some cultures more advanced or developed than others? And I think it's a really important question, particularly as we might be nearing, and many would say we are, sort of nearing the end of the age of Western hegemony, and beginning to see other parts of the world rising up with a lot more influence. And that's already, in the last 20 years, happened a lot more instead of the world much more interested in what's taking place economically in Asia. So I think, what's the factor here? What's driving this? And 1776, to me, because of those voyages and the fact you've literally got people in 1776 raising that question, saying, what is the difference between this society and that one that means they've advanced so much? It's a really fascinating window into a very complex and convoluted question, which I think in some ways bears down on all of us.
Let's talk about the answer to that, and one of those, at least, is worldview. And that is, as Christians, we recognize that how you view the world, what you think about everything from whether or not you are to go out and have dominion over the creation, or whether or not you believe that you are living in a created world. Sometimes that affected everything from the rise of modern science to even the way technology was developed. And in some respects, they were asking those questions in the 18th century, and we recognize, at least from a Christian point of view, there's an answer to some of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to thread the needle between I think you basically got to do justice to two enormously important components of the story. One is the theological, ideological background of technology or wealth or advancement, if you want to use that word, development, that sort of thing, which in the West has an awful lot to do with Christianity, because as you just alluded to, that you believe in a creator God who has set up the world to run in an ordered and predictable fashion rather than capricious gods squabbling with each other about things. You have a belief in progress because you believe eschatologically in a Christian worldview. You believe that God is going to come back and raise the dead. He's going to make the world new. So you believe the future will be better than the past. And that is itself quite a fascinating idea, because in many cultures you obviously really venerate older wisdom so much that you find it difficult to innovate, whereas in Western cultures in the 18th century, people were beginning to, not just the 18th century, 17th, 16th, 15th, were beginning to say, hang on, there's stuff to learn from the old guys, but we can step forward into new things. So you've got a sort of strong theological, intellectual underpinning, much of which is, not entirely, but much of which is in very Christian influence. But you also have a lot of material advantages which Western nations had, which I get into in several of the chapters, in terms of what sound like very mundane things and boring things to some of us, but things like where wood is and where rivers are and where coal is and what sort of minerals you have under the ground and how close the minerals might be to the sea and whether or not you've got navigable rivers and how far you are from the nearest related landmass and what sort of animals call your continent home and those sorts of things, which mean that in the end, people in Western Eurasia, which is what I largely mean by the West, had advantages over much of the rest of the globe. If you were born in Australia, no matter how Christian you were, if you were in the 18th century, you simply wouldn't have come up with the technology that developed in Europe because the local animals couldn't be domesticated, the ground couldn't grow the same thing. And as a result, there's a sort of material component as well as the intellectual, theological, cultural component. And it's the product of those two together, the ideas and the things, which created the kind of modern West as we know it. And so I have, in many ways, the book has 3 chapters on the material side and 4 chapters on the ideological, theological, cultural side. And I hope it's the fusion of those that really gives an account of why we are the way we are.
Fascinating. Let's, we can maybe get to another one, Educated, and we're talking about the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, a critique of pure reason. You have, of course, Edward Gibbon, the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But even before Darwin comes on the scene, actually almost 50 years later, you still have Carl Linnaeus, and you have just this whole idea of species and the rest. So this whole intellectual idea brings forth, again, a very important element that you talk about in terms of the E, educated, doesn't it?
It does. I like telling the story of the High Enlightenment through the lens of this year, because obviously the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement that lasts 100-odd years. You can't pin it, it's a bit silly to pin it down to a year or even a date in the way that I have. I'm deliberately doing it to try and pull together some interesting characters. But I think you do have the sort of high noon of the Enlightenment emerging in the years really between the 7 Years' War and the French Revolution.
Yes.
The French Revolution 13 years later changes a lot in terms of the questions Europeans are wrestling with. But in that period, so in 1776, as you say, you have a number of those leading intellectual figures you referred to, but really key works emerging in the study of biology, as you said, the classification of species, of understanding rocks and geology, which nowadays is a fairly niche pursuit. Most ordinary school kids, I guess, don't read books about geology, but at the time it was really cutting edge, trying to understand not just things like the age of the Earth, but also how the strata of things would mean, what minerals you might find where, and what that indicated about our relationship to the ocean and volcanoes and things were very significant when it came to questions of science and faith, for obvious reasons, as it would become more so in the century to come. And then similarly with writing of history. So people like Gibbon, Gibbon's the famous one, but there are a number of other fascinating characters I try and introduce in that chapter to talk about even the way that people would tell the story of the past, the sense in which, as Gibbon did, you had the ancients who were quite, sort of tolerant and lovely, and then Christianity came along with the clouds of darkness and suppressed dissent and was intolerant and burned all the documents it didn't like, and then eventually we came out of the dark ages into the light. That narrative, which really is Edward Gibbon, has seeped into the way that education all over the Western world has been done now for many decades. And they're really, in some ways, telling the story of the modern world and the ancient world in a very Edward Gibbonish sort of way. And he wrote that book in 1776. So there are intellectual developments that are taking place in this 1 year in all over Europe that are, I haven't even mentioned Kant, as you did, and David Hume and other key figures. And those intellectual developments profoundly shape the way that people now are taught things in school, or the documentaries that are made for public television or radio are profoundly shaped by this kind of story. And it goes back to 1776.
Can take a break, and we've been talking about this book, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West, by Dr. Andrew Wilson. And if you would like to know more about him or his book, we have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. I've had a chance to look at a few of those transformations. We'll come back and look at a couple of others that are very significant. And I think as we look at the past, it helps us understand where we are in the present and maybe even where we go in the future, especially how we as Christians respond to what is taking place in our culture. Much more coming up right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We're talking with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Remaking the World, and again, how 1776 created the post-Christian West. Now we come to a couple of others, and that is industrialized, that would be the Industrial Revolution, and then one that naturally follows from that, rich in terms of the great enrichment of Adam Smith. But again, I would have to say that even though in some of my booklets that we've had in the past on history of cycles, though we've talked about the Industrial Revolution, I had never really put that together, that James Watt's steam engine, also the mill at Bridgewater, even the idea of a lunar society, the whole idea of the Industrial Revolution can really find part of its significance in 1776, and that is the eye of your particular idea of it changed the world in a weirder way. But what did you find as you began to dig into that? Because machines were very important at this time and began to be even more important as we now had steam. No longer were you dependent on just maybe walking or horseback. Now you could take a train, you could take a boat. This made some significant differences in the world that we take for granted today, didn't it?
Absolutely, and in two really interesting ways. One of them is the one you just alluded to, which is that for the first time ever, we're not required for power. We're not requiring muscles, which is pretty much the only way you could power anything until the 18th century, where you either had to basically use your own muscle power, or you had to force or maybe employ someone else. But often, of course, slavery was a huge part of almost every economy up until the last 200 or 300 years. So you had to force human labor, or you would get animals to do it, and you would yoke them, but then they were expensive, and they needed to be housed and fed and all that sort of stuff, and trained. And so what happens in the 18th century is you begin to get a new source of power, obviously through what we would now call a steam engine. And early doors, it was, perhaps a lot more cumbersome kind of machinery than it is now, and it couldn't move, and it was very difficult to use, and it would only really be useful for draining mines of water in the early days. But it began to introduce a new way of getting people to do things. So one of the key two developments of those machines and steam engines was that it enabled power to emerge and eventually to become transportable and much more powerful than muscles within the space of a few decades, to the point you then, within 50 years, you've got railroads beginning to carpet Britain, and then eventually the rest of the world as well, and of course all the machinery that's followed from it. So that's one of the two vital developments. The other one is that for the same reason, the idea that you are now moving away from muscles into sort of steam and machinery, you end up with a depersonalization of power. Mm-hmm. So you can now delegate work to things rather than creatures, to animals or human beings. And as a result, you can get an awful lot of objects to do work that would previously have to have been done by a person. Now, some of that's very good, because some of that means, for instance, an obvious implication in your nation was it's very significant in the move to abolish slavery in the end, because it eventually becomes possible to do lots of work without needing slaves, and therefore those who were fighting the cause of abolition were able to effectively find an alternative way of generating wealth, which made it much easier for that moral and Christian argument ultimately to get a hearing. But you also have some downsides to the depersonalization. It means that you and I are now able to interact with, to be able to get all sorts of goods and services without interacting with a person at all.
Right.
And we're able to, what eventually happens is you start treating human beings as an instrumental means to delivering a service or a product that you have become used to thinking about as an impersonal expectation or right or entitlement. And you and I buy all sorts of things probably in a given week without interacting with a human being. And that, although it might be very convenient, is not always helpful for the way we can think about other humans. And sometimes even the people we do interact with, we don't really treat as full humans. We treat them as just purveyors of a service or an object, which is not how people 500 years ago would interact with their neighbors. And so there are some obviously enormously powerful developments taking place in this period of history, but some of them have got a dark side, and that many of them do. And this is a good example of that we eventually, it's not just that machines replace people, but we then start treating people like machines. And that's another thing that is obviously very common. You go and visit a distribution warehouse for Amazon or whatever, you think, wow, yeah, this is kind of what's happened. And so, yeah, machinery is doing a lot of the work, but that's not all good in the way that it makes us think about and treat one another. So, yeah, some fascinating developments. And, of course, I would then put a lot of that back on this, again, particular year and Watt's steam engine as a starting point. But within 50 years, we've got railways everywhere, and the modern world is, as we know it, is almost inevitability.
Again, quoting from my little booklet we made available recently to you, the age of steam and railways changed the world. Up until that time, we had manpower and horsepower, trains that run on steam, and steamships changed the world, and now people could move faster, carry heavier loads. But again, technology issues both sweet fruits and bitter fruits, and the bitter one is the depersonalization and the fact that we no longer had to interact face-to-face with so many people in the commerce, which brings us very naturally to the next one, and that is what you call the great enrichment. And one of the things I appreciate about the book is some of the charts, Andrew, that you have there. And one of those simply shows how we were sort of caught into this, what you call Malthusian trap. And then we have the great divergence, or even as you have not only the increase in economic development, the increase in life expectancy, the increase in social development. And I think we can very quickly bring some of that back to Adam Smith, writing first A Theory of Moral Sentiments and then writing The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776.
Yeah, so one of the things that fascinated me as I worked on this material, the discovery that got me was the fact that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was published the day after James Watt's steam engine started working at the Bloomfield Colliery. I was like, how on earth in 2 days have we seen such transformative events? So Smith is my window into that chapter because he is wrestling with how economic growth works. And obviously what he said has been enormously influential. And you can't study economics without Adam Smith, and with good reason. But what's fascinating is that he was actually describing a state of affairs that in the year he was writing it was becoming obsolete. He was trying to explain why nations don't necessarily prosper in the way that you might expect them to, and why they can't move beyond a certain level of growth, even as it was beginning to happen for reasons that had nothing to do with his book. So I don't think that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations caused enormous economic expansion. I think it's just fascinating that in a historical period when he was writing about it, it was beginning to become superseded by events for some of the reasons we've just been talking about. I mean, Adam Smith's book didn't cause Watt to invent the steam engine. It didn't cause the steam train and all the things that followed from it to get invented. But Smith was describing how economics works and how the wealth of nations grows,
right,
at a time when it was beginning to become obvious that there was a growing gulf between northwestern European nations and much of the rest of the world in terms of the amount of wealth you can generate. So the Malthusian trap, as you just referred to, is there's a sort of the idea that the more money you create, the more children people will have, and therefore the amount of average wealth per person will not go up. You'll just have, you'll use the extra surplus you generated to feed more mouths, and more people will make it through to adulthood, and the human race will always remain at roughly the same level of wealth, which is pretty much what had happened from the age of King David to the age of Shakespeare. What happens in the last 300 or 400 years, which is so unusual, is that human beings punched through that ceiling by generating a lot more power and calories and food than they needed to feed the human beings that were around. And as a result, wealth began to skyrocket, and it's still rising now. And that was not because of anything Adam Smith said. It's just fascinating to observe the connections between the way he explained the problem and the way that his contemporaries were exploring solutions.
Yes.
A fascinating story.
Well, let's, if we can, also move on to D, which is Democratic, the American Revolution. But you begin the chapter by reminding us that really there are only 6 countries on earth that do not claim to be democratic. They either claim to be a democratic republic or a republic, and even sometimes that's really misleading. But we go from a time in which we sort of take for granted monarchy, and we take for granted kind of mercantilism, and we see that changing into this idea of a capitalist free market idea, but also the remarkable change where today virtually every country claims to be a democracy, and a lot of that goes back to Declaration of Independence in 1776.
It does, and this is where I have to give your nation its due. I very, very much enjoyed writing and then talking to Americans for the last 3 or 4 years about these themes, basically trying to sort of relativize the achievements of the American Revolution and say, well, it's just one of a whole load of different things happening. But in this chapter, I really have to say, yeah, this is the product of the American experiment. There's no doubt about it. I think the technology and the material growth and the globalization and the intellectual ferment, with a couple of notable exceptions, Ben Franklin and others, but really is taking place in Europe. By the main, that's where most of the interesting stuff is happening. But in the case of politics, of course, and government, the opposite is true. And it is definitely down to the American experiment that the preponderance of democratic republics all over the world today can be traced. And of course, it very quickly kickstarted almost a domino effect, to mix my metaphors, in European nations as well. So you get the American Revolution, but very quickly you start getting revolutionary fever emerging in all sorts of other nations, often based on very similar ideas.
We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a final comment or two from Dr. Andrew Wilson as we talk about Remaking the World, how 1776 created the post-Christian West. We've looked at a number of issues, but I thought we would focus on two others. First of all, ex-Christian, that's the E for the rejection of Christianity. And that gets us into David Hume, really gets us into both the English and the French Enlightenment. And again, I would have to say that Dr. Wilson, we're dealing with that even to this day with the rise of the so-called new atheist and, of course, the attack on Western ideas or even Christian ideas. And a lot of that can be traced back to 1776, can't it?
Yeah, it can. And I know by now it probably sounds like a broken record. He's going to trace everything in existence back to this 1 year. But I really think with this one, there's a very, very strong case. So if you were to look at the different trajectories within the world of today, the contemporary world, with respect to belief in God or not, you would have at one end people who are confessionally Christian. They would say, like you and me, you'd say, we believe in Jesus, we love him, we believe in one God in three persons, all that. Then you have people who believe in a God, but maybe don't believe in the Christian God. And then and it might be deistic, or there might be just a sort of a different sort of deity. Then you move across to people who say, I don't really believe in God, but I believe in in the beneficial impact of thinking that there is a God, or at least the Christian God, in a society like ours. And it can be, there'd be benevolent skeptics. And then you move across and find people who say, actually, I've got more problems with Christianity. I don't want Christianity to have the privileged status it does in the nation. This would be, you get quite a lot of books of this nature, and I don't believe there's a God. But when you hear their ethics, they're still basically saying, so Richard Dawkins would be like this, that it is still very important to be compassionate and kind and loving. Basically, they start listing the fruits of the Spirit when you ask them what a good life is. And then at the extreme, you might get a very small number of people saying, I want to go even further. I want to say not only is the Christian God not real, and not only is the Christian message harmful and the Christian church damaging, I am going to try and overthrow Christian ethics more generally. And I don't believe you should be compassionate to your enemy just because they are there and just because they're human. In fact, I think you need to take a much more purely naturalist view of everything and treat people in the same way that animals would, the strong eat the weak, and so on. And which is, in some ways, of course, what Adolf Hitler tried to do, which is one of the reasons why very few people today will be prepared to say they do. And my claim is that if you think about that spectrum, moving from the I love God through to the I hate the Christian God and I want to overthrow all Christian morality, all five of those positions can be found in their embryonic forms in 1776. You obviously have lots of Christians. You have lots of deists, who would be some of the people we've already mentioned in this conversation, who basically don't believe in the Christian God, but have a fairly benevolent view of what it means to be. So Thomas Jefferson would be like this. Didn't hate Christians, wasn't trying to stamp out Christianity. He just didn't share, certainly not Orthodox Christianity. Mm-hmm. And then you move across and you get some people who are more hostile, someone like Voltaire. His catchphrase, écraser l'enfant, just crush the infamy, crush the Roman Catholic Church, destroy it. But he still wanted people to believe in God. And then you move across to the more radical French Enlighteners, people like Denis Diderot, and they would be Christianity is a malign influence, but their moral framework is still very Christian. And then at the extreme, you have someone like the Marquis de Sade, who's also writing in this period, who is an absolutely abominable man, but he is quite self-consciously trying to undermine and overthrow Christian morality from root and branch. And so in a way, I don't think it's a stretch at all to say all five of the kind of on that spectrum I traced of people today, people you would see in the local Barnes and Noble represented in the religion, philosophy, and history sections, actually all five of those positions find their roots with people writing in 1776.
And the one that actually connects to that so easily is the last one, the romantic revolution, or what we oftentimes refer to as the sexual revolution. And we've had Carl Trueman on this program talking about the rise and triumph of the modern self and the strange new world. And here you really kind of continue from this idea of a Marquis de Sade. You get to Voltaire, you get to Rousseau, you get to kind of the sexual revolution, which we oftentimes put in the 1960s, but you have the first sexual revolution really there in London, don't you?
Yeah, this is an attempt for me to, having given away quite a lot of ground on my patriotic roots to Americans in the previous two chapters, have to kind of try and snaffle it back. Yes, I think that obviously the sexual revolutions, any major cultural revolution doesn't happen in 5 years. The revolutions that stick take 100 years, really. Cultural change doesn't happen in that way. Right. It's not like the Beatles start writing a song and then within 5 years everyone's totally changed their morality. So the 1960s version of the story is not one I'm persuaded by. What really happens, a bit like the first sexual revolution, at the beginning of Christendom, is you end up with Jesus teaching and embodying something radically different, the early church internalizing it, practicing it, and over 200 or 300 years, the sexual ethic in the Roman Empire begins to change so radically that the whole Western world is now dominated really by a fundamentally Christian conception of consent and all sorts of other values which people didn't believe in the ancient world. But in the same way, at the end of Christendom, you have another the second sexual revolution, which really begins in the late 18th century and hits the mainstream, if I can call it that, in the 1970s or 1980s, or even in the 2010s, and starts being legally recognized in some ways in the last 10 years. What you're seeing is people now putting things on their flags or in their Supreme Court decisions that were really being thrown out there for the first time as radical suggestions in the 1770s and 80s. And so I think that's not all I'm doing with, I think Romanticism as a movement is actually much more interesting than just the sexual component of it. But that's the one that in our modern day hits us the most visibly, probably. And of course, as Carl Trueman would have no doubt said when he was with you, that those things are not existing in isolation. They are expressing a particular view of human identity, of what it is to truly be a human person, of things like authenticity and sincerity and self-expression, which are also coming from the books and the plays and the poems and then eventually the music and poetry that's being written by people like Goethe and his friends and Rousseau and others, and obviously cresting really at the beginning of the 19th century. So I think that sort of sexual revolution in London, coupled with the romantic revolution in the way people began to write and express themselves, was an enormously important part of explaining why the modern world has the view of sexuality and selfhood that it does.
And again, that is the interview that we had a chance to do with earlier today with Andrew Wilson. And again, Dr. Andrew Wilson, author of the book Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. Might just mention that in the last part of his chapter, he does give some suggestions on how the church can react to this. And in some respects, some of this is about how the church reacted in the past. But I think this is a very significant book. And if you find yourself wanting to know more about him, first of all, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. We have a link to desiringgod.org, then /Andrew-Wilson. And you will then see a number of blog posts that he has, some of the most recent one, Practicing Faith in a Post-Faith World, and a variety of other issues. We also have a link to the book, which has actually been out for some time, so probably will be difficult to find in your local bookstore. So again, let me encourage you to go to the website. First of all, even though it's a 300-page book, I would just again commend Crossway Books for making it available for a very little amount, given the fact it's a hardback book with all sorts of illustrations and a couple of photos and others. So it is something that is quite easy to obtain either in hardcover or Kindle. And so again, that information is available at the website there as well. So again, I hope that you've appreciated the conversation today about remaking the world. It is a reminder that as we look to the past, sometimes we can understand the present and we can begin to look to the future and make very significant plans. One last time, again, Dr. Andrew Wilson, author of the book Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. We have information about it on our website, and you're listening to Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate point of view and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let me begin with a question. Do you ever particularly watch a film during a particular holiday season? Maybe at Christmas, you watch The Christmas Carol, or maybe It's a Wonderful Life. Certainly at Easter, maybe on television, you see the Ten Commandments. There is something about using film in a way that might really deepen your understanding, and this book that we're going to be talking about really helps us understand all sorts of films that we could use during different times during the church calendar. In some respects, we're coming back to the issue of film again. You might remember that on Monday, we had two guests in studio. We were talking about this new film, Brave the Dark, in which we had both the writer and the producer in studio with us and talked about that film. And then even the other day, we talked about the particular Lord of the Rings, because, of course, we had one of our guests by phone who was talking about Tolkien, J.J.R. Tolkien. So in some respects, this wasn't intended, but once again, we're coming back to this very important issue of film. And the particular book that we're talking about here is Films for All Seasons, Experiencing the Church Year at the Movies, and it is written by Abby Olcese, who is a writer on film and popular culture and on faith. Her work has appeared in Think Christian and even in places like RogerEbert.com. She's also the film editor of The Pitch. And Abby, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Let's talk about the concept, which you talk about early on, of watching films as a spiritual practice. Each year we encourage parents, if they have kids going off to college, to go to our Mind Games conference. And one of the sessions that we do in the evening that is done by somebody who's a lot more experienced in this regard than I am, is on how to watch a film. And it is an opportunity to get them to start thinking about a film from a worldview perspective. As a matter of fact, we had some of the kids say, "You've ruined the films for me," because now I go on the film, I say, okay, what's the point of view here? What are they trying to accomplish? All the rest. But there is a sense in which you point out that watching films can be a way to really begin to enrich and even engage some of these great spiritual ideas. Can you explain that?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, having people talk about how to watch a movie critically, I think, is a great way to start, because that's how it started for me. Was kind of trying to balance the movies that I loved with what I was learning in church, and how some of those messages conflicted with each other, how some of those messages kind of complemented each other in surprising ways. Basically, just kind of seeing the parallels between the stuff that I was watching and the things that I was learning, and trying to figure out how to make that make sense in my brain. And I think one of the things I enjoy doing with this book, which is a reflection of what I enjoy doing in my career, is kind of making those connections all the time. Like, for example, I think I used this in the book. There was a moment when I was in, I think, like middle or high school at a Maundy Thursday service at my church, and I felt this very specific kind of emotional rumbling inside me of just kind of the drama of that particular moment of the church year, right, where we're dealing with feelings of tragedy and betrayal and uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen next. And I realized that I had felt the same way the last time that I had watched The Fellowship of the Ring, which the first movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the book as well, obviously, kind of end in a similar way, where everything's kind of at a tipping point and you're not sure where it's going to go. But, you know, story-wise, this is the first entry in a trilogy, so the story isn't over. It's going to continue, and things will probably resolve. But at that moment, you don't quite know how. So I think there are all kinds of dramatic reflections of some of the same things that we see in the Bible that are reflected in a lot of popular storytelling. And I think at least from an artistic perspective, I see that, and I think that's as common as it is because there's truth to that, right? Like it comes from somewhere true, but also because it's such a compelling thing that you can't really look away from it, which I like to think that the Bible in its most compelling moments is that for me as well and for other people too.
Again, talking about the book Films for All Seasons. It is published by our friends at InterVarsity Press. It came out a couple of months ago. If you would like to find it in your local bookstore, great. But we've also provided a way in which you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. And Abby, one of the things we talk about oftentimes on this program is rhythm. And in your book, you talk about how our lives are ruled by routines and rhythms. And I think one of the geniuses in this book, and there are some great insights, is the idea of doing this along the church year or the church calendar. Can you explain that?
Yeah. And I know your listeners may be coming from a variety of liturgical backgrounds, which I kind of hoped that the book would reach out to folks no matter what their background was. But some churches are more into kind of the specific ins and outs of the church calendar than others. But basically, the church calendar covers essentially the entirety of the Gospels and some of the prophets as well, and the epistles, by starting with Advent, the waiting for the birth of Christ, and then through Christmas and Epiphany, which is sort of the coming of age of Jesus, and into Lent, and then Easter, Holy Week, and then Easter, and then the Ascension of Jesus, and Pentecost, which is when we celebrate sort of the birth of the church and the early Christian movement. And then kind of skipping ahead a little bit, we get All Saints and All Souls Day, which kind of fall at the very end of the church year, where we're celebrating significant figures in the history of Christianity, but also significant figures within our own lives who kind of helped our own spiritual formation. So I like it because as somebody who sees the world in story a lot of the time, it kind of takes you on a journey from the very beginning to all the way through to kind of the legacy of the church and where we're headed, and thinking about all of the stuff that we've just been through and how we carry those legacies with us moving forward.
Let me, just before we take a break, talk about how to maybe use this effectively. And I love what you put together, because when we read Scripture, we talk about reading the passage, looking at any cross-references, maybe doing some time of meditation and how this reading connects to your life, and then contemplation, what God may be trying to tell you. You use that same three-level kind of idea with a film, viewing what were the moments in the film that stood out to you, what's your reaction. Level 2, the idea of meditation. How do the themes in the movie connect to your life, and what perspective are you asking, maybe, or trying to understand or get some perspective on? And then finally, contemplation. What might God be inviting you to consider? So in some respects, some of the ways in which we analyze Scripture can be used as sort of a model for how we analyze some of these films.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of an invitation to critical thinking in general. That I think it's influenced the way that I watch movies and influenced the way that I look at Scripture simultaneously, and it's also influenced the way that I just interact with the world when I'm given a new piece of news or a new issue that I care about, or that people close to me care about. There's always kind of that level of your first reaction, what makes you feel that way, what truth there is in it, what you would like to know more about, and just kind of letting yourself be curious, giving yourself permission to be curious. And I think it was very helpful that this book came out through InterVarsity Press, because my parents were former InterVarsity staffers, and they were very familiar with the process of manuscript study and taught me how to do that. And so I think it was a very informative process basically throughout the whole thing.
We're going to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll look at kind of 9 different sections in the book, Films for All Seasons. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Kerry Newhoff has been producing a podcast for church leaders and has been on my radio program. A few months ago, I quoted him because he documented that the current percentages for church attendance are inflated. His more recent podcast not only documents that evangelicals aren't attending church, but also provides reasons why many churches are losing members. He quotes from a researcher who concludes that there are as many non-attending self-described evangelicals as there are mainline Christians in America. He says this marks a seismic shift in how the church will do ministry. Of course, the goal of discipleship isn't church attendance, but certainly should be considered a first step. He provides 3 reasons churches are losing members. First is greater affluence. Americans with money have options such as technology options, travel options, and options for kids. He doesn't say this, but I would add the impact of team sports that often has families on the road to attend games instead of going to church. A second reason is self-directed spirituality. People are looking less to churches and leaders to help them grow spiritually. He uses a good illustration. No parent makes a visit to a doctor's office without checking the symptoms online. Before buying a car, they will probably research it online. A third reason people are attending church less often is their failure to see any direct benefit. People always make time for the things they value most. Now, he isn't advocating for churches to do more promotion, especially since the youngest generation is sick of hype. Adding more high-tech AV in the church service isn't the answer. Instead, people are looking for more authenticity and community. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Abby Olcese. Again, as we talk about films for all seasons, it is a book published by University Press. Maybe find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it as well on our website, pointofview.net. Let me, for those of you that maybe have a small group where you might occasionally want to go to a film and use that for a discussion, or maybe you would like to follow through the church calendar, you can do so. We're going to go through the 9 different sections if we can, but at the very end of each particular film that Abby mentions, there is a set of discussion questions, so it's almost plug and play. It would not take much to either watch the film, because again, most of those would be available on DVD or streaming or something like that, or if the film might just be too difficult to deal with, you could go to YouTube and maybe just watch the trailer and begin a discussion, or maybe a few key elements. Oftentimes there are those that are available, and that is the way in which you could maybe use this in an effective ministry, especially for young people that are sort of into the arts and films, and this is something I think would be very helpful. So, Abby, the first one is Advent. You've got 4 different possible films as an illustration there, and some of them relate to such things as hope, or joy, or faith, or peace. In some respects, that is also helpful, because if somebody wanted to emphasize this, or for even people teaching a Sunday school lesson, or even pastors listening right now that wanted to use an illustration of hope, they might pull something out of a film that you mentioned, or to illustrate the idea of joy, to pull something out of a film. So in some respects, this is helpful not only for the film buff out there, but for just the average Christian who lives in this world where we're surrounded by people that have gone to the films, and this becomes a great opportunity for a great discussion, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that was kind of the hope behind all of it, not to, copy Advent too much. But that first section of Advent, the themes for each of those chapters are part of like the traditional themes that accompany an Advent wreath. And I think some of them might change from church to church, but those are more or less kind of the four core ones. And I've had a lot of great conversations with folks who are trying to, they're interested in using the book either with their small group or with their church or even just with their family. They have somebody in their family who really likes movies and they want to kind of use that as a point of connection. And I think all of those are great ways to use this book. I've even used it at a few movie nights at my own church and have had really wonderful conversations with other people there.
Let's talk about each one for just a minute. Hope, The Last Jedi. Faith, The Bishop's Wife. Of course, Joy, Paddington Bear, which I get a kick out of, and Peace, Joyous Noel. In some respects, if people say, well, I'm not really into the Star Wars thing, I don't know how you could not be because most people have it. Or maybe I've never seen that film, Bishop's Wife. There was, of course, a newer version of it, but you talk about one of the older ones in 1947. There are some ways in which you can kind of dig deeply into some of these films and really surface some of the themes that actually are very key to this time of Advent, aren't they?
Yeah, and the idea with that, the hope with that, is that I can kind of encourage people to, even if it's not a movie that they particularly love, to see why other people might like it, just because that opens up a spot of connection, and not everybody agrees on taste, but I think anybody who's interested in a conversation in movies can kind of be interested in the context and sort of the stuff that makes that movie go. So hopefully there's a little bit of something in here for everybody. The Bishop's Wife particularly is one that I really like coming back to because it was made in the 40s, but it has such a surprisingly modern message and really compassionate message that accompanies it that always surprises me when I watch it. So that was one that I was really excited to kind of put in here alongside a little bit, some more contemporary films to kind of encourage people to widen the scope of their viewing.
And I like the fact that you give a range because you might have some people that say, well, I'm not really into Star Wars, but okay, I might dip into this one that came out in the 1940s. Or, well, do we have one for the kids? Yeah, we got Paddington and Paddington 2, which you suggest would be a way to surface joy. And how could you not get a smile on your face as I just started laughing, just even using the words Paddington, because, again, you give different options, which I think are helpful because oftentimes what happens, and I'm sure you're like a lot of families, okay, what are we going to watch tonight? Okay, what DVD do we have out here? What streaming service do we have here? What's on Netflix? Okay, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. Your book gives us some rhythm, some rhyme, and really a sense of maybe after the film is over, whether it's in the home or whether you went to the movies, most of the time it's in the home now, you can have some discussion, and those lively discussions sometimes are as fruitful as watching the film itself, aren't they?
Yeah, they really can be. And I tried to keep the discussion questions in there, not so much as like a quiz, like did you see the movie, but like getting at some of the themes that are kind of contained within the movie and how you might see that reflected in it, because everybody's perspective is going to be a little bit different. So like I obviously have mine, which is presented in the essay, but I love the idea that people can come away from, 2 or 3 people can watch the same movie and have 2 or 3 different ideas about what worked for them and what didn't, what they saw, what made them curious. And that's kind of the fun of discussing movies, right, is to kind of have that hopefully really friendly and constructive debate about what it is that moves you about art.
I find lots of times people say, I saw such and such, and I said, I didn't even pay attention to that, and you caught that. And so, again, that's one of the advantages of having a group. Well, let me finish off. Of course, we've mentioned Advent. Then you have a chapter and a section on Christmas and a section on Epiphany. I might put those two together because those are some various movies that people might think of. And most of the time, if you were to ask people what they would watch at Christmas, it's going to probably be things like ones I just mentioned, some kind of Christmas theme. Instead, you pick some that aren't Christmas themes per se, but they really emphasize the birth of Christ.
Yeah, exactly. So I've been a part of some really great conversations with children of men that over the years kind of really helped me to see it as a nativity movie, to the point where I was kind of mad at myself that it took me as long as I did to figure out that was what it was. And it's I hope when folks read the essay that they can see those parallels really made clearly, so that they don't have to wait as long as I did to figure it out. But so there's that, and then there's The Night of the Hunter, which ends at Christmas, and so like you can say in that sense it's kind of nominally a Christmas movie, but I think it's also got a lot of really good. Both of those movies together have a lot of really good themes that kind of emphasize the birth of Christ, the vulnerability of the birth of Christ, and kind of the truth of the kind of the circumstances that everybody who was there would have been feeling in some way, shape, or form, whether it's the shepherds or Mary and Joseph or the kings coming to visit. Like there's certainly kind of a sense that this is something that doesn't get done by one person, right? That it's all communal, that everybody needs to kind of come together to help this happen, that prophecies get enacted by a number of people, right? That are all kind of chosen and work together.
Again, one of the largest sections of your book is on Lent, in which you really have 6 chapters. And let me, since we're coming to a break in about 2 minutes, maybe just get it started by the first one is just the idea of Ash Wednesday. And then maybe you can kind of just give us an overview, and we'll get into the details after the break, of taking people through each week of Lent. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so Lent is such a dramatic season. It's, I think, probably my favorite in the entire calendar, just because of the themes that it asks us to reckon with. And I tried to set up that section of the book so that it kind of takes you on a similar journey, from recognizing our own mortality to kind of admission of sin, and kind of thinking about the systemic implications of that, how we can overcome it, the kinds of people we want to be, and what it looks like after we've kind of reached our own sort of place of enlightenment, but the world still looks the same, and how we kind of live with those two things in concert together.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, one of the things we might talk about for just a minute is one of the films in that Lenten period is Groundhog Day, which I'm sure most of you probably have heard of. And I thought it was kind of interesting because I would never have put that in the list, but really she spends some time talking about how to exult in monotony and time loops and cycles of sin and some other things that probably would never have occurred to you. So again, it's all part of this book. I'll hold it up for those you watching online, and it is in Films for All Seasons. Abby Olcese with us, and let me just mention, I suspect most of you just want to sit back and take some notes and listen, but if you'd like to join the conversation, I'll open up the phones, 800-351-1212. Perhaps you have used some films in your own ministry with young people, or to begin a discussion about the gospel. Perhaps you'd like to add to some of that as well. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about her or about the book, we have information about all of that on our website at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Abby Olcese as we talk about films for all seasons. And Abby has been with us talking about a couple of issues, and we'll get into Lent again, and then Holy Week and Easter. But again, one of the sections that you focus some time and attention on is Lent, and it does seem to me that that is everything from Ash Wednesday all the way through the Lenten seasons. But I did point out one of the things that may have surprised some people is Groundhog Day. And yet I remember that I think it was even Roger Ebert at one point didn't really like the film and later came back and thought it was very significant. My producer just talked about when he would teach on some of these issues, he would use that. I know we've done a week of radio programs years ago in a printed form on some of that. So in some respects, that gets us back to this issue of sin, of cycles, of meditation, and it all kind of fits into some of the things that you talk about in your book, Films for All Seasons.
Yeah, Groundhog Day is a movie that I grew up watching, and so the book it was based on an article series that I did for Think Christian during the pandemic, which, as you may remember, Groundhog Day was a really popular movie during the pandemic.
Yes, for sure.
Because, yeah, the concept of time loop movies was very kind of familiar to everybody. We were all kind of stuck at home, and every day kind of looked the same. And it just kind of got me to thinking about the journey of Bill Murray's character in that movie, where he starts off as being kind of jaded and thinking that this job, this world is kind of beneath him. And by being forced to be stuck in the same day over and over and over again, he comes to recognize sort of his smallness in the face of everything, like the spot that he fits in this system, and how he can kind of, in some small way, make it a little bit better every day, which I think was something that we all a lot of people, I think, found that kind of encouraging during a time where we were trying to be good neighbors and good friends and good family members to each other. But the ways in which we could do that were sort of limited based on in comparison to what we've been able to do in the past. So when it came time to write the book, I was thinking about that in terms of not just trying to be a light in the darkness in some small way, but also the fact that kind of like Phil Connor's experience, our experiences in the world tend not to change that much. Like the world itself still has a lot of the same systemic problems that repeat themselves day after day, after year after year. And yet we, at the end of Lent, are kind of in this space where we've confessed our sins. We've thought about the kinds of people that we want to be. We've thought about the systems and struggles that make it hard to be that kind of person, and how we can try to, with the help of communities of faith and people supporting us, try to overcome that. But now we're stuck in this space where maybe we have reached some form of enlightenment that the rest of the world still looks the same. And how do we operate in a world that still looks like that when we ourselves are different? And I think Groundhog Day kind of offers some really interesting lessons in that regard.
And again, you also got chapters on the dark night. There are no white nights, and who do you turn to in pressure, and bad times at El Royale. I'm bored of men like you. I mean, there's some other great themes that run through that. But in order to maybe finish the book, let's, if we can, move from Lent to Holy Week. And that gets us, of course, to something you talked about, Monday, Thursday. And the film that you use there is The Mission. Now, again, that's not for faint-hearted people, but whether it's that one or Good Friday, Rogue One, the Star Wars movie, there are some ways in which when you come to Holy Week, there are some films that elicit some of those same kind of emotions that we should be feeling as we work our way through the church calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. And The Mission, kind of like Groundhog Day, was a movie that I grew up watching. That I think my parents introduced that movie to me when I was maybe in high school, and I have just a very vivid memory of having a conversation with my mom for maybe like an hour after the fact about the events of that movie and how difficult it was and how unfair some parts of it felt. And that conversation itself also reminded me of kind of when I first encountered the concept of Holy Week and the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ as a kid. and just being kind of bumping up against this wall of just, why is it like this? Why is it not fair? Everybody is supposed to, the world is supposed to work out for good. How come it doesn't in this really epic way? And I feel like the mission is kind of, it's based in part in the real experiences of Jesuit missionaries who were working in South America at that time. And so it's kind of writ large, an example of that. And it's really interesting to kind of see how each of those characters deals with the concept of grace and what that grace requires of you, the kind of sacrifice that it requires of you, and how the rest of the world, just often does not work that way. And when those things are in conflict, it can get really, really, really messy. And I think the movie does a beautiful job of exploring that particular, one particular instance of that I think is pretty widely applicable. And Rogue One for me kind of works in a similar way to, as I mentioned with Lord of the Rings. You have characters who are kind of at a precipice. They've made a sacrifice. They've sacrificed their lives, and they don't know whether or not the sacrifice that they've just made actually worked. Like if it was worth all of the work that they put into it. But we as viewers, obviously, we know that the rest of the Star Wars story doesn't exist without them doing that. So there's this kind of interesting kind of disconnect between what the characters know and we know. And I think that's a really fascinating tool.
Again, that brings us to Easter. And I thought, again, since we just talked about Lord of the Rings, how about the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Because then we have all sorts of situations, reconsidering Edmund, you call it, and also just, of course, Aslan's death and resurrection. This would be sort of a natural, but again, you try to pull out a couple of other themes, don't you, that maybe we should be thinking about?
For sure. So I think one of obviously the parallels in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to the death and resurrection of Christ are pretty clear, and they're really obvious, right? Like C.S. Lewis is writing that story, the story of the crucifixion for kids. And so there's that. One of the things that always kind of bugged me as a kid, and something that I found really interesting about the film adaptation of that movie, which came out when I was in high school, was the way that it treated Edmund. Like, we understand that he's supposed to be kind of an example of, Christ being willing to die for everybody, even people that don't seem like they're worthy. But the book doesn't really offer a whole lot of context as to why he's like that. I think it works really well as like kind of a fable, but the more I thought about it, the older I got, the more it kind of confused me. And I think the film does a pretty good job of offering some suggestions as to what might have led Edmund to be the way that he is. And I think that leads him to be kind of a richer character, at least for me. And I think it makes his transformation really interesting in terms of what we do when we realize that we're in the wrong, and how we atone for having been complicit in some, not great things that we did because we thought that was what we wanted at the time, but it was an illegitimate means to get a thing that we really had that we thought would answer a deeper want but didn't. And so it makes me more thankful for the death and resurrection of Christ, because I find it as like a really effective illustration of what that means for me personally.
Again, we could get into a couple others under Easter, but just to keep it moving, let's, if we can, focus on Ascension Day. And you talk a little bit about that as well, because there are some very important themes. Of course, one that comes from Midnight Special or Avatar. Speak to that issue for just a minute, because that may be, again, a connection that people might not necessarily readily see.
For sure. And Midnight Special is, that was kind of a lesser seen movie that I would love for more people to watch, because I think it's a really interesting portrayal of what I think discipleship looks like from maybe an emotional standpoint. There are characters in that movie who are kind of going through something. They're trying to help a kid who clearly has some kind of supernatural abilities and has said that he has specific needs that they want to help him meet. And they only know what they know, which is not very much. And so the fact that they love this kid so much and that they want what's best for him, to me, kind of reflects some of the stuff that we see in the Gospels about the ways that the disciples interact with Jesus. And Avatar is, I think, kind of an interesting concept of like kind of spiritual transcendence. Kind of the other side of that coin is the idea of making all things new, and the way that the kind of forms of deity in James Cameron's sci-fi movie are kind of reflective of the idea of kind of spiritual connection with something that is sort of beyond the physical. And the movie has some really beautiful ways of doing that.
Yes.
One of them is through the main character's own transformation from his human body, which is
yes,
broken. He's paralyzed, into the body of the Navi that he's been kind of using as his own avatar for most of the film, and then finally gets to kind of properly commune with into this new body in this new beautiful and amazing place that is, I mean, literally it's up in the stars. So there's some connection there that kind of makes it another interesting parallel to Ascension.
We'll take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about Pentecost and All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the film Films for All Seasons. The book deals with Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, the Holy Week, Easter, Ascension Day, but last two, Pentecost. And you have here Guardians of the Galaxy, Imperfect Heroes for an Imperfect World, that's for sure, as well as a turbocharged community of faith, Fast and Furious. So these are opportunities to think about the issue of the Great Commission and Pentecost and the time in which the Holy Spirit came to earth and to believers. And you take this as an opportunity to once again look at some of these important films.
Yeah, and Pentecost was initially kind of a difficult one for me. Again, when I was writing this as part of an article series for Think Christian, I think Pentecost was the last column that I was assigned to write on. And at the time, it was just a word that I knew, right? I knew that Pentecost was a thing. I was familiar with the passage in Acts, but I had grown up going to churches that didn't really talk about it much beyond that, and so I was really kind of coming up empty as to what deeper themes there were to kind of dig into. And as I did some research, I realized that there's a lot of opportunity to talk about kind of the international nature of the church, the really diverse nature of what the church has become. And there's also an opportunity to talk about what our own communities look like and the diversity to be found within those. Like, how are we kind of noticing the many different backgrounds and needs and interests and abilities of the people within our own church communities? Are we giving those needs opportunities to be filled? Are we giving those abilities opportunities to be used in ways that are constructive and help to build the community and help people feel appreciated? And it turns out that superhero movies are actually a really good analog for that, because they are movies about, like in the case of Guardians of the Galaxy, and also kind of the Avengers movies too, of characters who come from different backgrounds and don't necessarily get along at first and don't even necessarily want to, but are coming together to serve a greater purpose. And through that purpose, discover that they have abilities and interests and needs that kind of complement each other. They become their own community and their own family, and they're tested in the ways that healthy communities often need to be tested. And so that became a really fun opportunity to kind of dig into those movies. And Guardians of the Galaxy is one that has really thorny and very vulnerable characters that really need to learn that lesson more than almost anybody else. And so it was kind of fun to be able to dig into that and show the ways that kind of illustrates community at work.
And when you read Fast and Furious, that's about family as well. You have all these very diverse individuals, an FBI agent and a guy that's heading up a gang of thieves and a lawman and all sorts of things. But over time, they all become a family, don't they?
Yeah, and I know that's kind of a particularly ridiculous one, but part of the reason it's in there is that I'm trying to encourage folks to look really expansively. Like, you can find messages of interest and curiosity and value in almost any genre, including really goofy, like, action films. And the Fast and Furious movies have always been kind of discussed and lauded for the fact that they have a really diverse cast. They have international casts, and the people within, like, each of those characters are given plenty of opportunity to really be their own person, which is something that for a long time a lot of Hollywood movies were not very good at doing, and still aren't in some cases. And so this kind of became an opportunity to not only appreciate that, but to also appreciate kind of the deeper implications of what that could mean. So it is kind of a goofy movie, but it's also one that, and that entry in particular is one that kind of deals with kind of conflicting and expanded ideas of what that family of characters kind of means.
Let's see if we can. Last one, All Saints Day, November 1st, All Souls Day, November 2nd. And, of course, there are holidays in Mexico and the rest. But talk about, again, that one probably was just as difficult to write as the one on Pentecost. But, again, you select some films, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this one was a pretty easy one for me. I spent a lot of my kind of formative adult years in the Episcopal Church, which is really big on All Saints Day and All Souls Day. And so I had, plenty of opportunity to kind of dig into kind of the legacy of what that meant. And I always found it really moving, the idea that when you are part of a church, you are kind of part of a legacy of people who have been, acting in the name of Christ for generations. And, way before I was here, way before my parents and my grandparents were here, and hopefully, way after I'm gone. And I get to be one little kind of drop in that ocean. And so it's really kind of fun to dig into the legacy of other people who have done extraordinary things, but also to kind of remember that you don't necessarily need to do, like, amazing, world-changing, extraordinary things. Sometimes you can just be a supportive person for someone, and that can be really meaningful as well, and that can be really important to their own spiritual journey. So there are plenty of opportunities to write about, like, actual canonized saints, like A Hidden Life, which is honestly kind of a good example of both, because it's about a man, Franz Jagerstatter, who was executed by the Nazis for refusing to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. And so it's a very his act of defiance was pretty small in the grand scheme of World War II, but it was a really good example of somebody who was very committed to their principles and very committed to living a Christ-like life, and had to sacrifice a lot, as that movie is really good at illustrating, of how beautiful and simple his life was. And it would have been really tempting to kind of give in some regard, to compromise somehow, and yet he never does. And so it's a really, in turbulent times, it's a really interesting story to kind of look back on and see kind of what is required of us as believers and how we can, even in our own small way, be forms of light to other people. And there are other, I talk about Coco in here as well, which connects to the Mexican holiday of Day of the Dead, and is an opportunity to kind of reflect on significant people in our own lives and in our families and the ways that we're connected to them and the ways that it's kind of important to recognize the entirety of a person and the entirety of a family, not just the good parts that we want to try and remember, but we need to acknowledge the stuff that's a little bit harder to live with too, because there's plenty of opportunity for grace and growth in that. And then Dick Johnson is Dead, the Kirsten Johnson documentary, is one that I'm particularly fond of because it's a love letter from the filmmaker to her father, who is suffering from dementia, and she's trying to kind of make the most of the remaining time that they have together. And it's a really moving example of how much she loves her dad and what she hopes he will get to experience in the afterlife, because her dad is a lifelong Seventh-day Adventist, and so she kind of mixes scenes of their time together with scenes of what she imagines heaven might look like, the things that she wants to get him to experience. And those scenes are so beautiful in the way that they clearly explore how much she knows and loves her dad, and how much he means to her.
Let me just say again, the book is entitled Films for All Seasons, Experiencing the Church Year at the Movies. If you would like to find it in your local bookstore, it's published by InterVarsity Press, but we also have a link to it on our website there, so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And if you don't like the list that she creates at the beginning, she has other suggested films at the end, suggestions for further viewing. So again, Abby, thank you for writing the film, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View to talk about how we can use these films as part of our church calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for giving me the platform. This was wonderful to get to talk to you.
Again, if you're a casual viewer or maybe a movie buff, I think you're going to really enjoy this. For those of you that maybe have a small group and would like to stimulate some discussion by going to a movie or by showing a movie that already is available through DVD or some kind of streaming, you could do that as well. And I think you will find it to be a real conversation starter and very helpful for you in that regard. So one last time, about 27 chapters, 200 plus pages, and a great resource for those of you that maybe would like to dig deeper into the films and maybe see some of the spiritual principles in them. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.